Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. It's very exciting to be launching this new publication, which has been a project that we've been working on internally in the WTO for a while now. Let me just say that this event is being live streamed. So hello to the online viewers as well, and not just to everyone who's here in the room. And online viewers know that they can send questions to dialogues@WTO.org. I have my iPad here and I'll be looking out for your questions. Because this event is being live streamed, it's important to only have one microphone open at a time so that things can work well on the WTO YouTube channel. This is a very serious issue, and our panel will be talking about this issue, and we are thrilled that Director General Ngozi has put this issue on our agenda. We have organized a number of events on illicit trade in food and food fraud before, a trade dialogue on food in 2022, our annual symposium of the Agriculture Division at the end of last year, 2023, was dedicated to the subject as well. It's an issue that's of huge importance to consumers, to producers, to governments, to regulators. And so it is certainly one that merits time and discussion. We have a fantastic panel for you today. We will start with opening remarks by WTO Director General, Dr. Ngozi, after which we will transition into panel mode. We have with us Ms. Helen Medina, the CEO of the World Spirits Alliance. She's here for now. She will be joining us on the podium later. We have Jeff Hardy, Director General of the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, Trace It. Thank you, Jeff. And we have, of course, the permanent representative of China to the WTO, Ambassador Lee, and the permanent representative of Mauritius to the WTO, Ambassador Dwarka Kanabadi. And we have WTO Deputy Director General Jean-Marie Pogam, who's always supported us in this work. So I'm very excited to start this panel. Director Ngozi, over to you.
Well, thanks, Dua, for doing this. Thanks to you and the division for launching this work today. And I'm particularly pleased to see the high caliber of panelists we've been able to get, some of our most senior ambassadors and those also joining us from the outside. So thanks very much. It's really my pleasure to be here today to launch this WTO publication. If I'm not my usual bubbly self, I have a cold, so excuse my low voice, but I am really happy. This publication on illicit trade in food and food fraud, and I'd like to start by giving you the context of this particular study. We all know that international trade takes place both legally and unfortunately legally too. Every day, governments and regulatory agencies around the world are forced to spend time tracing and combating illicit activity. So when I arrived at the WTO in 2021, I was a bit surprised to learn that while illegal trade had periodically come up in committee discussions, the organization had not addressed the topic in a substantive manner. The WTO rulebook is designed to discipline international trade and to prevent the law of the jungle from prevailing in international trade relations. But illegal trade and fraudulent activity undermine our efforts to level the playing field for economic actors. And I just want to say that from my perspective, some of the activities that are linked to illegal trade can be deadly. We had a case in my own country of illegal trade in drugs that really resulted in a lot of loss of lives. And we had a fierce lady who was the chair of the Food and Drug Administration, and she fought this, almost lost her life doing it because it's a huge trade that makes a lot of money. And that's why I feel quite passionate about the subject. It's not just about the loss of resources and money, but also about the loss of lives. So we started looking into this issue, and we estimated that trade misinvoicing, that is discrepancies between reported imports and exports, implied the value of illicit trade was worth $535 billion in 2019. That's a lot. That amount was equivalent to nearly 3% of global goods trade, resulting in tariff revenue losses worth $87 billion in 2019. Motivated by the COVID-19 pandemic, our first issue study looked at illicit trade in medical products. As I just told you, I really had personal interest in that, but also because of what was happening during the pandemic. And we found it was a complex global problem posing serious economic and public health threats. Our estimates show that illegal trade in medical products constitutes anything between 1% and 4% of trade in the sector, worth as much as $28 billion in 2019, a figure that understates the negative repercussions for public health from things like ineffective or even toxic medication. That study was launched at a high-level session at the Aid for Trade Review, and I might say that UNODC partnered with us in that particular study, and they are very keen in partnering with us on this work. That study was launched at a high-level session at the Aid for Trade Review in 2022, together with the several international organizations, UNODC, like I said, UNCTAD, the World Customs Organization, the OECD, UNIDO, WHO, and WIPO. This contributed to an important global conversation, and I encourage members to address the issue in relevant WTO bodies and use trade tools more effectively in the fight against illicit medical products. I myself was surprised at the quite substantial amount of interest it generated amongst other international organizations. Only a few weeks ago, illicit trade featured prominently in discussions at the UN Chief Executive's Board meeting convened in Chile by the Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And I was very proud and pleased that when the conversation came around, we were able to talk about what we at the WTO are doing about this trade, because the UN Secretary General, they're all becoming more concerned. And he was even surprised and pleased to learn that we had already partnered with UNODC to produce one study. I think we all agree that we would try to cooperate more closely to tackle some of these issues. So that's the backdrop for our subject today: food fraud and illicit trade in food. Here, when I talk about this now, I refer to substandard foods, falsely labeled foods, and foods whose ingredients have been tampered with, as well as counterfeit and smuggled products. Our Agriculture and Commodities Division took up the challenge of looking at this issue, and I do want to thank you, Do, and the whole team, as I said, for preparing the study. Given that the terrain is both multifaceted and new to us, our colleagues conducted this study in collaboration with other expert institutions, and we are grateful for the guest contributions from the Food and Agricultural Organization, the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, from the private sector through the International Seed Federation, and from nonprofit organizations such as SAVE and the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade. The WTO Agriculture Division has organized trade dialogues on this subject, including last year's annual Agricultural Symposium on Illicit Trade in Food and Food Fraud. The experts from across different agri-food sectors who presented to that symposium include many contributors to this publication, as you would have seen. The new study covers a wider range of issues related to food fraud, starting with the surprising fact that there is no global definition of the term. I should say here that a definition may be imminent, since the Codex Alimentarius Commission is developing a new guidance document on food fraud that is expected this year or next. The prospect of an agreed definition matters because, as we all know, it's hard to tackle a problem that has not been properly identified. Our new study goes into the seriousness and scale of the problem and examines the various regulatory approaches being used at the national, regional, and international levels to tackle food fraud and illicit trade in food, And of course, it looks at how WTO rules may be relevant. The problem is sizable. Although the global cost is difficult to determine given the clandestine nature of the activity, annual estimates of the economic loss to the food industry are in the range of 30 to 50 billion US dollars, which does not include losses associated with illicit trade in alcoholic beverages. I think if we added that, it might be take it to another dimension. We also discovered that the problem impacts all continents and food sectors, ranging from olive oil to honey, from wines and spirits to spices. It spares nobody. Food fraud is also a moving target. New methods to defraud consumers and the public are uncovered every day. Serious health consequences are, of course, the most worrying, with periodic reports of poisonings and death. But we should not underestimate the economic damage to farmers, big and small, and to the agribusiness and agri-food sector. So if two of the key messages from this publication are that the problem is sizable and that it impacts most sectors and continents, the third message is that the WTO can help tackle the problem. The WTO rulebook has many rules that can assist governments in confronting this challenge. Of particular relevance are the WTO Agreement on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures, the SPS, which enables members to regulate food imports based on science and risk assessment techniques, and the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade, which enables members to address deceptive practices. These are two of the very important agreements in this organization that we're very proud of. And I don't think people quite realize the extent to which these agreements help with our daily lives. They are really not aware. But many other WTO agreements are also relevant. For instance, fully implementing the WTO's Trade Facilitation Agreement would reduce excessively cumbersome border procedures and red tape that present opportunity for criminals to exploit. In addition, the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, the TRIPS Agreement, is a vital tool for members in tackling counterfeit food and beverages. We need to be leveraging the whole WTO toolbox to fight illicit trade and food fraud. It's my hope that this publication will help spur discussions and action. We're starting to look at various other areas, including illicit trade in plastics and illicit trade in the digital environment. And our colleagues, as I said, at the UN, are also very pleased and interested in cooperating on this. One thing that the publication makes crystal clear is that just like the old adage puts it, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Our efforts are better placed in preventing fraudulent activity than in limiting its consequences after it has occurred. It is through that prevention lens that I would really like us to examine the contributions the WTO can make to tackling illicit trade in food. So thank you very much. I wish you very good deliberations and a good panel. I'm going to remove myself shortly and not infect you. Until I've taken the proper medicines. But thank you all for coming. I'm going to stay a little while and then I'll just slip out quiet.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ngozi, for an excellent introduction. And thank you, above all, for having put this topic on our radar screens in the WTO. It has been an incredibly exciting project to work on. So I would now like to move to Jeff Tracett. Jeff, could you walk us through the size of this problem, its magnitude, its impact on the Sustainable Development Goals, and what you think some of the solutions are, and perhaps the role that you see for WTO?
Yeah, thanks, Do. I'd be happy to do that. And also thank you, Dr. Ngozi, for inviting me and Tracett here. Tracett is a business NGO, and we work across 12 different sectors that are vulnerable to illicit trade. So today we're focused obviously on illicit trade in food, but tomorrow that might be illicit trade in pharmaceuticals, and the day after we might be trying to stop counterfeiting worldwide. So again, I'm honored to be here. I think it's I'm really pleased to see WTO take this kind of leadership. I think there are two dynamics that are going on right now in this building. The first is you're widely regarded as the custodian for international trade to make sure that the multilateral trading system delivers benefits in terms of, economic development and prosperity and ensuring that there's a level playing field, especially for the developing countries and, that trade is an instrument for inclusive, sustainable growth, right? Now that's your mission. But the other dynamic that's going on is illicit trade and the growth in illicit trade that's really robbing you of all the benefits that you're trying to achieve by promoting the multilateral trading system. So I'm pleased, that you're focused on this. I think primary objective here is to try to find some balance between trade facilitation and the negative social economic impacts associated with illicit trade. Now, I know that the GATT agreement, for example, has certain provisions that lay that out, but I think meetings like this, the work that DOA is doing, is the first step in understanding that there are significant negative social and economic impacts. So again, I appreciate you holding this meeting. To get to your question, on the size, I mean, Dr. Ngozi mentioned some of the numbers that we've estimated for illicit trade in agriculture and food at around $50 billion. But if you add in illicit trade in fish, for example, that's another 50 billion. If you add in losses from illicit trade in spirits, which we're going to address here shortly, that's another 200 billion or more. So quickly you see that this starts closing in on $500 billion. If you look at that in other sectors, counterfeiting, the OECD, for example, has been reporting that the level of counterfeiting worldwide is 450 to 500 billion. Pharmaceuticals, you mentioned, Dr. Ngozi, you mentioned the estimate you had 2 years ago, 28 billion on pharmaceuticals. Well, a lot of the industry standards show that that could be 10 times the amount. So it's a problem with a wide range of negative impacts, but we're looking at food in particular. And I think I'm reluctant to say it, but it's true, is that I think that the problem of illicit trade in food is going to grow and get bigger before it gets smaller. And I think the reason for that is because there are some main drivers that are going to present greater opportunities for that. And one is the universal need for food. The other is the population growth that's going to require more and more food delivery, increase in food prices. Now, why am I mentioning that? And a lot of you know in the post-COVID era, food prices have gone up. When food prices go up, that makes alternatives, cheaper alternatives, more attractive. A lot of times those cheaper alternatives are the illicit products that we're talking about today. And then there's the point of the elongated supply chain. The longer the supply chain, the greater the number of nodes and delivery points, the greater opportunity and vulnerabilities there are for criminals to exploit. So I think, again, this meeting is at a good time because I think the problem is going to get worse unless we step in and take charge. So to continue on with the question, I mean, let me try to define it a little bit. The executive director mentioned that we don't really have a definition. There's a number of ways to describe it. We try to just talk about that it's the deliberate substitution, tampering, adulteration. Whatever is done, it's for economic gain outside of the legal system. So that's one way that we're defining it. And I think it's important to think of illicit trade in food in terms of two categories. One are commodities. So that's sugar, tea, coffee. And you can imagine if you're trying to regulate. The other category are packaged goods. Now this is, coffee that's been processed, for example. And it's packaged and labeled and sometimes trademarked. So those are the two general categories for illicit trade. I think what I'd like to do next, though, is just maybe run through 3 or 4 different ways, different forms of illicit trade, and maybe give you some examples. And the number one way really that we're concerned about is adulteration. And that's where a criminal body would mix an extraneous substance, material, or ingredient into an existing product. So a lot of interesting stories here. But if you take shredded Parmesan cheese, that's often, they'll take wood cellulose and mix that in. Why do they do that? Because they can get more for the dollar, creates greater profits. But there's also examples of corn syrup that's used to dilute, pure honey, adding water to milk, right? Just to increase the profits, adding cheap spices to premium spices. And then there's the scary examples that, bring on consumer health risks, for example, associated with toxic or ingredients that are added to baby formulas that turn out to be toxic. And there are quite a few cases and evidence of this happening. It's almost hard to believe. Another category is substitution. That's where a low value product is substituted for a high value product. Here's a great time to think about fish. A high value fish like a halibut or a sea bass is substituted with a low value fish, a white fish that it's indistinguishable. Other examples of substitution include horse meat in the place of beef. Why? Because horse meat's cheaper, greater profits for the criminals to do the substitution. Mislabeling is another category that's often used by criminal groups in food fraud. That's where a product is falsely labeled, for example, as gluten-free. I don't know if any of you have gluten intolerance, but this is a big deal if you do and the product is mislabeled. Or meat that's labeled as kosher and it's not. So, these are ways that they can elicit the high profits out of that same product without going to the measures that it takes to produce a kosher food product, for example. Falsifying origin is another one that's probably easy to get your hands around, but the labeling, mislabeling of ordinary table salt and calling it, Himalayan pink salt, which costs 5 times the amount, generates profits for criminal groups who are able to infiltrate the supply chain. In terms of counterfeiting, the executive director mentioned counterfeiting. This is something that we're all familiar with. Most of the tactics that I just mentioned are embodied in counterfeiting. But the difference is that now the product is put in a package with a brand, a recognized trademark and a logo, where the consumer is willing to pay a higher price for that type of product. And the consumer feels like they're safe and they can trust that brand and that there won't be adulteration or substitution or a toxic ingredient added. And then the last one I want to mention is smuggling. It's a little bit of a different animal, smuggling is, because it's driven by price differentials between countries, sometimes neighboring countries, origin and destination countries. It can come about by excise taxes that are imposed by one government but not on the neighboring government, which gives incentives for criminals to take advantage of that price differentiation. It can be also stimulated by government food subsidies, where a certain country receives food cheaper than the market price, and the criminals exploit that and re-export those food products to other countries to profit from. Seafood is a good example of smuggling. Illicit alcohol, that I know Helen is going to go into in great depth, is a major, major international problem of smuggling alcohol across borders. Finally, Doa, if you'll allow me to continue, I wanted to just briefly mention the relationship between illicit trade in food and the Sustainable Development Goals. When we're talking about all of this, it's important to address, well, what are the damages I said in the outset of my remarks? If the WTO is going to take a leadership position, I think you really need to get your hands around what are those economic and social losses. And to do so, I think the UN Sustainable Development Goals are the best sort of roadmap to use, because they address the world's, most acute economic, social, and environmental challenges. So a couple of years ago, Tracit did a report looking at all 17 of the SDGs, and we mapped that against 12 different illicit trade sectors, and we found that all 17 of the SDGs are negatively impacted. In terms of today's conversation in food fraud, we have found that 11 of the 17 goals are negatively impacted. And I think I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to highlight a few. And let's start off with SDG 1, which is no poverty, 2, zero hunger, and 3, good health. All three of those are negatively impacted, 1, 2, and 3 out of the gate, because as you know, access to healthy and affordable food is fundamental to addressing these issues like global poverty and hunger. But if you have illicit trade that's destabilizing food security, that's disrupting the supply chain, that's reducing availability, that's putting upward pressure on prices, undermining fair markets and reducing incomes of farmers, collectively, all three of those are undermining our ability to achieve the goals. And I think the main takeaway that I want, to be heard is that we collectively, the WTO or the UN itself, is not going to be able to achieve the SDGs by 2030, or if you happen to extend the deadline, you're not going to be able to achieve these goals unless real efforts are taken to mitigate illicit trade. There's a couple other goals that I'd like to mention, 8 and 16 on economic development and criminal activity, but I think I can just leave it at that for now. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Jeff. If you could switch off your microphone, thank you. Helen, I'd like to invite you to come to my seat and to speak from here. We would love to hear from you about your industry, how it is impacted by this problem, and I will bring your nameplate.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, good morning. I'm glad that we were so flexible to move me around like this. Well, thank you, Doa, for inviting me to this panel and having Dr. Ngozi, the Director General, next to me speaking about this is a real honor. It's also an honor to have His Excellency from China and Her Excellency from Mauritius and the Deputy Director General, and of course you, Jeff, as well. I'm with the World Spirits Alliance, and it's an international trade organization with 27 spirit producers and associations from around the globe. So we are working very closely with Jeff's team as well, and with the Alliance Against Countering Counterfeit Spirits to work on this issue, because we know it's a real problem. So we work with enforcers, we do a lot of training, intelligence, and tip sharing to really tackle this problem. But we know that there's a lot more to do, so they're really excited here to be with the WTO. So to put this problem into context, we wanted to share with you, or I want to share with you, that the WTO recognizes that this is a real problem, and it estimates that 1 bottle out of 4 is illicitly traded. So that is quite large if you think about it. And in broad terms, what is illicit trade to our organization? So there's about 5 categories. Jeff did speak about it briefly, but just so that you hear it from my perspective, we have smuggling. Smuggling is a big issue for us. That covers both ethanol, so that can be put into the spirits production, as well as finished products. So these are items that are coming into a country, but without paying the import tariffs at all, or the fees, right? Then you have counterfeit, and Jeff talked about this quite broadly. And these are the fraudulent kind of imitations or branded beverages, as well as industrially manufactured beverages that are either unbranded or sold under unregistered brands. So that's the counterfeit. Then there's artisanal. Now, these are the beverages that are considered illicit if they are made for commercial purposes. And often they violate the local laws, right? So this is an issue for us as well. Then you have tax leakage. These are alcohol beverages that are legally manufactured in a country but are not paying the tax. And then there's surrogate. Now, this is an interesting one I didn't know anything about, but have learned about it. This is the alcohol that's not is meant for not human consumption, but diverted into the market for alcohol beverages. And this is quite dangerous for human health, okay? So this is a real problem for us as well. So the thing with illicit trade, and Jeff has done a good job kind of describing it for you, but for us, it's also important because it fosters corruption, right? It denies the governments here the potential of revenue that is needed to really improve the socioeconomic conditions. As Jeff said, it's really important for the SDGs that we do, get the revenue that you need to make sure that you can work on the SDGs. And if illicit alcohol trade really diminishes that possibility. Finally, it poses serious risk to consumers. This is a real problem for us. That's why we're looking at food fraud. That's why we're looking at illicit trade in food, because it's helpful. It's really harmful for consumers. So just to give you an example of how this works for us, particularly when it comes to alcohol, often it's associated with a tax hike, right? Because that's when people and the sort of illicit traders see an opportunity. So what happens is if you have a huge tax hike in a country, often this reduces the revenues and there's a steep rise in illicit trade. And in one country, this happened where it was 125 hike of on spirits taxes. And so what we saw was that there was a steep side of illicit trade. Then we also saw actually a overall consumption of the alcohol was increased at the same period. We also saw that there was huge organized crime around this that was dominating the market. So this was a real problem. And what in the end was that there was huge losses in tax revenue. So what we see in the work that we do is that there's a lot of there's a correlation between fiscal regulatory regimes and illicit trade, which is why the WTO is a good place to combat this. Okay, so what we see is that the Trade Facilitation Agreement Committee could really do a lot more in this space. I'm glad to see that people are nodding on this. This is a place where the private sector can actually bring testimonies. They can share with you their knowledge, and then you can learn from them and their experiences. We could also encourage members to start voluntarily share national information on how they are implementing the TFA to reduce problems at the border and to reduce illicit trade. And on this point, thank you, China, for doing a lot of good work in this, and Mauritius on the TFA. And China's been done a great job when it comes to the digital stuff, so the digital customs part of the TFA. So we find that that's a really important bit. And Chapter 2 actually was written, there was a lot of work done in this space in Chapter 2, as well as a place to work on illicit trade. The other bit was the WTO TBT committee. This is a wonderful, wonderful committee. It's a place where you can come together, discuss issues. You get to see the proposals before they come out. And it's a time to be frank with each other. And we've used that. The Spirits Alliance has used this as a place to raise concerns about alcohol stamps. They're designed to prevent distribution of untaxed or potentially unsafe alcohol. But what we found is that these stamps can easily be counterfeited. So it's not really that silver bullet. And we've been able to have that discussion at the TBT. So we find that it'd be really nice to have that kind of conversation ongoing. We also think that the trade policy review, this is another wonderful mechanism that you have. You guys have so many great tools, really. And this would be a really nice one to also have a nice discussion there and to review what countries are doing when it comes to illicit trade. So, what we've understood about illicit traders is they're smart, right? These guys will go where where profit can be made. So often it's where there are import tariffs that are high and there's high domestic taxations that are not really adapted to the local context. So you really want to take a look at that area, because that is where the illicit trade will happen. They will come to your borders. So it's really important to punish and prevent illicit trade through robust controls and enforcement. It's important to educate. Really, consumers need to understand this. And this is where we can really help as WSA, and my membership can really help with this, the education. But as business, we're contributing to these ongoing discussions. It's a really wonderful, important discussion that we're having here today. The OECD has taken this forward as well, and we're really happy about that. But I'm happy to hear that other UN members are interested in this, and other UN family is interested in this as well. And we're really, able to step up and work with you on this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I think that was a very important testimony of how serious this issue is to your sector. To hear that it's 1 in every 4 bottles is alarming. So thank you for being here, for making the time, and for telling us how we can help in the WTO. Ambassador Kanabadi, I'd like to turn to you for your country's experience. How has Mauritius dealt with this issue? How is it experiencing this issue? And what can you tell us about the role that the WTO can play in this space? Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for organizing this, and to TG for coming as well. I wanted to recognize my colleagues in the room, Maria and Marie-Pierre, and also other colleagues and friends who are here, because every day you ask yourself in the full day that you have, what things of value did you learn today? And certainly I think this is one of them. And as you know, my minister was to be here this morning. Now, he wasn't scheduled to speak, but I told him, Minister, there's this thing going on. He's the Minister of Health. So obviously food standards come under his purview. And unfortunately, his time for speaking at WHO just came up just ahead of this meeting. So I had to abandon him and come. So I'm not going to read out his notes. I'll share with you a couple of things that I want. One of the things WTO can do, and I come back to what Helen was saying, was doing events like this one, sensitizing people, but using the trade policy reviews, because I wanted to come to that. In being discussant in a number of trade policy reviews, I was quite shocked to see that some countries don't actually have food laboratories. They don't have food standard agencies. They don't have the basics to check what's coming into their market. So people end up buying whatever is cheapest, because in addressing zero hunger, we buy what's cheapest because that's the only thing we can afford. So who is going to help these people set this up? So when the trade policy review is over, and I don't want to dent my colleagues from TPR because I like them very much, it's just, can we make a list of what we thought were fundamental deficiencies and to see how we can address this, remembering that WTO has convening power, and you can bring together people to work on this for you and tell the donors under Aid for Trade, hey, we just noticed that X, Y, Z countries, and I can give you a list. They don't have sufficient standards. They don't have sufficient institutional capacity to do this. Can we help them better? Now, the EU, for example, does a lot of work on this in the ACP countries. But the reason it does this with the ACP countries is because it used to import from the ACP countries, and it wanted to make sure that whatever reaches the market of the EU is safe for its consumers. If you go to countries and you tell them, food fraud, they say, oh, commercial business, this one will put pressure, the other one finances my campaign. We don't say these things aloud, right? So I don't want really to be dealing with this. When you tell them, you know what, your people can die. It's food fraud, it's serious. This is why the one thing I was going to suggest to you is that next time you do this, the next World Health Assembly. You do this with World Health Organization and you bring in UNODC. And I was going to suggest IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, which might sound surprising, but they're helping us with our food safety as well. They do a lot of work. So you might want to bring them in and bring in the health ministers. A high-level event to listen, because the health ministers will be the first ones concerned about this and will take the picture back. I was stealing little copies of this to go and share, of the report, because I thought it was exciting to have this report. They are the ones you need to reach out to. They are the decision makers. We are the talkers, but they are the ones who will take the decision. So you need to talk to them for them to go forward on this. This is one. Now, coming back to the question of my country, when there is no country in the world that hasn't been through a case of food fraud or smuggling or anything it is. The question is, when you're a net food importer, like Mauritius. And I'm talking about, I know what Maria is going to say, net food importers who are actually eating the stuff that they import. Sometimes we use some of them to re-export or to do other things. They come in the value chain, and we've had that problem. So I'll share it with you. When you import food for your own consumption, and Mauritius imports almost 70% of that, you have a duty to make sure that your system in place is foolproof, that it's reaching the people without too much difficulty. Then you have the other part. You're importing components that go into what you're producing, and you don't have control over that. And we had one case like this where we're importing chilies, red chilies from an area to create spices. And then suddenly, when it reached Europe, we had a sort of call saying, oh, by the way, we think we've detected something in there that's not quite right. Clearly, it was Sudan 4. It couldn't be anything other than Sudan 4. The chilies look bright red, the spices look beautiful, but then we don't know. So clearly, at our end, when it was coming in, we didn't know at that time that this chili had been contaminated with Sudan 4. But being a small country, luckily our people react fast, and we have strong institutions. HACCP in Mauritius is mandatory. You have to have, especially for certain food systems, you have a food standards agency, you have a food laboratory, you make sure that your people are eating what is safe food as far as possible. But there will be always the odd ones. And those who undertake these practices, and I'm sure Jeffrey can tell us, they are very smart. They're always smarter than you. They will always find a way around. So a bit of Sudan for a bit of other things, and they'll find a way of, hopefully this will reach the market without too much problem. You spoke about honey and HFCS, HCFS, high corn fructose syrup being put. We know olive oil, all of us. We know the case of tomatoes as well. But in the case of Mauritius, we produce sugar. But our sugar is of the highest quality. We call it Coca-Cola grade sugar with a very low dust residue. So sometimes you get, when we're supposed to be exporting to the region, we capitalize on the quality of our sugar to the region. And then we find, hey, other sugar being passed up as our sugar, not quite right there. Not quite right there, because they don't say it obviously, but it's not the same quality of sugar that we're talking about here in that one. But this is just a small example. I think what I want to say to you is, small islands, in trying to do this, your biggest challenge is what? You're small. You have to control port of entry. You have to control your food handlers. You have to control literally every aspect of the supply chain. You have to control everything. Now, I have 13 health stations. I have 2 points of entry. They're both controlled. I also have 170 staff in Mauritius who do the inspection of all this. So when I look at the statistics, 2023 for 10 months, it told me there's been 18,000 inspections. That sounds good enough, because if you've been to 18,000 inspectors through 170 people, not bad. You've had like 400 contraventions established. You've had, improvement, whatever it is, certificates being handled to them. So you have people doing the work. Then you have the Food Standards Agency. But where is your real problem? Your real problem is that I don't even have a representation in Rome. I cannot participate in Codex Alimentarius on a regular basis. Who's going to do the standards for me? When I have a problem, where do I go to? So I have to rely on others doing this work for me and coming to me. And it's the same for other things. I work a lot with UNODC because I'm accredited to Vienna. So I know the work that they do, and I'm happy to work with them to do good things. But the basis itself, sometimes we're absent. 2, when I want to do something good, I have to choose. I have so much money. I need to put this here. I put it here if health is concerned. So you help governments by showing the health aspect, working with WHO, put your money here, you need that. But I might need some support. And the support comes from technology. What is the latest technology for me to detect fraud? And I don't have that technology. Who will sell me, a small country of 1.3 million, some interesting technology? Commercially not interesting. So for the region, 5 small countries, 5 small islands in the Indian Ocean, try to think of me as that region. And then I want someone to come and tell me, can that wonderful bank of technology we set up for the LDCs also help us in this kind of case? Who can help us trace and purchase the latest technology available to avoid this kind of fraud? I know I'm not answering your question fully, but I wanted to bring this to the fore because you have to make choices. And in making choices, you have to make sure that your people are best served. And sometimes when you make those choices, it is still not enough. So you need help from other people. So multi-stakeholder approach. And this is where WTO can help us, hopefully, on that one. Thank you, Doa.
Thank you very much. What a statement, and indeed incredible to hear about, the experience of Mauritius. You spoke about being a small country and all the challenges that are faced by a small country. And I'd now like to move to a very big country and to hand over to Ambassador Lee to hear about China's experience and, again, what you see as a potential role for the WTO on this topic.
Thank you. The big ones also have our own problem, just like China, the US. Yeah, thank you. It's a truly pleasure and a privilege to join today's event. I also attended the agricultural symposium on the same topic last November. So congratulations to Secretary and all the authors for your dedicated work in ruling out this publication. It offers a broad range of the studies and the perspectives from the international organizations and the private sectors in combating this very persistent issue, including maximizing the role of trade and the current WTO rule book. A lot of information and suggestions are really useful and thought-provoking. As guided by the moderator, I will take this opportunity to share with you the China's practice and also some reflections on this issue. As you know, China is an economy with a large population and a vast market. Food safety has always been a priority for our government. The persistent efforts have been made to ensure the food security for our people. In recent years, in view of the diversity and the complexity of the illegal food activities, China has adopted targeted efforts in the following areas. First, identifying the major challenges and taking concrete measures. Recently, China's major food safety concerns include the trademark infringement, adulteration, and countervailing. In order to containing and deterring these illegal activities, the competent authorities have taken rigorous measures, in particular targeting on cutting off illegal supply chain from the sources, continues conducting large-scale destruction of counterfeit and substandard goods, and regularly publishing typical cases, and so on. In rural areas where illicit food issues are relatively more serious, the emphasis is on promptly addressing violations, such as the addition of non-edible substances to food and unqualified meat products. Swift legal actions are taken against any such violations, ensuring that food safety standards are upheld, at the same time deterring the potential offenders. Second, establishing a modernized governance system for importing food safety. Primary measures include streamlining the registration process for overseas production enterprises, conducting regular audit and inspections of these registered enterprises, optimizing supervision and sampling mechanisms for imported food, strengthening rapid response capability at ports. These efforts have largely ensured that the imported food products meet stringent safety standards, thereby protecting consumer health and bolstering consumer confidence. Third, incorporating the information technology to enhance administrative capability in food law enforcement. I noted the report also touched on this important too. The IT has greatly increased the synergies among different administration and agency work, enhancing the efficiency in addressing food fraud and illicit trade in food. In addition, the social media platforms are emerging as effective tools in China. In recent years, the use of the popular social media platforms like the TikTok, WeChat, and the Weibo, transparency and public awareness have significantly boosted, which plays a crucial complementary role in enhancing the food safety in China. When it comes to the role of the WTO, or actually, as already mentioned by by DG and Ambassador Usha, I agree all this said. I think the WTO should play and actually have already played a role helping members tackle illicit agri-food trade through promoting the legal trade in food. I'm sure you've noted many insightful suggestions that have been referred in this report. Taking this opportunity, I would share 3 points. Firstly, WTO rules never prevent members from taking measures on food safety. In the WTO rulebook, such as GATT Article 20, SPS agreements, TBT agreements, TRIPS, and also other agreements, I think members can take the appropriate measures to address the concerns. As the largest food importer in the world, the government of China has a responsibility to also take the measures to ensure the food safety. Secondly, food safety measures should not be used as a protectionism. When measures are to be developed, of course, the WTO rules shall be well followed. Actually, if the legal trade can be more easier, at more low cost, have a more easy access to the other markets, I think the illegal trade can be also depressed. These are the two sides. Lastly, the WTO platform can be utilized to strengthen the cooperation and experience sharing. WTO bodies are playing a key role for members to express trade concerns on others. In the meantime, they also provide multilateral platforms for members to cooperate and learn from each other, especially in the changing world, such as digitalization. For example, with the introduction of the e-commerce in the cross-border trade, the fight against food violation is facing new challenges. Food operators exploit regulatory loopholes, such as the different legal definitions, regulations, and the enforcement procedures for illegal food and counterfeit food at home and abroad, to avoid supervision. This has already resulted in new food safety risks. Besides, when illegal producers and operators set up their network server abroad, investigation will become almost impossible without cooperation among competent authorities. So in this context, no single member, wherever is small or bigger, can solve all the problems by their own. So fortunately, WTO is in a position for members to share their own practices, including the laws, regulations, and explore possible ways to enhance cooperation, such as discussion on the best practices. The TBT Ministerial Declaration delivered during the MT13 also provides ways forward against new changes and new challenges. So my message here, WTO has already played its role in tackling the illicit trade in food and the food fraud, and more work could be done. Thank you for your attention.
Ambassador, thank you very much. I think that was an incredibly thought-provoking menu of options for the WTO to explore. As you mentioned, the WTO is already doing a lot of things in this area, but could do more. Deputy Director General Jean-Marie Pogam, you've heard the panel, and of course, you've been involved with us in this issue since the end of last year, your participation in the annual symposium on this topic in December. What are your reactions to what you have heard?
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Doa, and thank you to the excellent panelists for your energy and enthusiasm in tackling this matter. Actually, most of the messages about the WTO have been already said, so I just have to say the rest, and I'll try to recap it around 3 points. The first one may sound trivial, but I don't think it is. It's obviously WTO is a place where trade rules are being negotiated. So every time you promote the WTO, you promote legal trade. And this is a temple of legal trade, which by definition opposes illicit or illegal trade. So strengthening the organization is helpful in itself. The second point was touched upon by all of you on this table, is that the WTO provides several entries which are directly relevant to the fight against illicit trade in food and alcohol beverages. I'm not going to recap them all, but 2 or 3 of them have not been mentioned, and they are directly relevant to allowing our members to exercise control over their borders and to enforce their trade law. One of them, for instance, is custom valuation agreement, which aims for a fair and uniform and neutral approach to the valuation of goods for custom purposes. And applied correctly and consistently, it can be very instrumental in the fight against the fraud. Second one is I'm talking all the unknown agreement here. The pre-shipment inspection agreement is also directly related to this through the verification of the quality, the quantity, and the price, and the currency exchange rates also for the goods which are being crossing the border and used effectively. It can help also. Of particular importance are, they have been mentioned, the SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and TBT agreements that you were just referring to. This is just a flavor of all the entries that we can have, which are directly relevant to this fight. The third point, I think, is more or less implicit in what has been said, especially by Jeff and Helen, has to do with the link between, and also you, Ambassador, the link between criminal activities and incentives on the market. I mean, to visualize that, we can use a very famous historical example, which is the example of the prohibition of sales, production, and distribution of alcohol in the United States at the last century. And directly related to the prohibition, we had a growth in the control of criminal gangs over this trade till the end, till the repealing of this legislation. So every time governments think about restrictions or trade restriction, they have to think about the arbitrage between the incentive or the disincentive on illegal activities. Not to say that the WTO is having any say about when do you restrict or not restrict. And Ambassador, I think it was right that you would remind us that the WTO never prevents any country from regulating whatever the country wants to regulate. But still, this incentive to lower trade restriction, to promote liberalization, is also a disincentive to criminal activities. And the fact is that our trade negotiations on agriculture are very much related to that for different reasons, for level playing field reasons and others, but also can help by lowering the barriers to legal trade of food and other related products, can help disincentivize the criminal activities which are related to that. So this is, in a nutshell, what I heard from this table. I would add one final comment about the fact that the WTO offers to its members technical assistance and capacity strengthening for the implementation of this rule. We have several programs which cover from border controls, intellectual property rights, and application of product standards. One is really dedicated to the SPS capacity building. It's called STDF. So this should be used to promote this legal framework against illegal and illicit trade in food. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie. In fact, the menu of options is building. Many of you have mentioned things that the WTO can usefully do, from involving the ministers of health and, capitalizing on the fact that the World Health Organization is here in Geneva, to TPRs, trade policy reviews, and raising the issue in that context, to continuing to use the TBT committee, to opening trade, as you said, since that is sort of the counterweight to illicit trade, as you mentioned, Ambassador. So it's a big menu of options, and indeed, hopefully, we will, take that work forward after this event and go deeper into the issue. I'd like to now give the floor to one of the authors who's with us today, one of the contributing authors, Gabrielle Marceau. She is a very well-known lawyer in the WTO and has contributed a chapter to this publication, which I would encourage you all to read. It's a tour de force, if you will, where she goes through the entire WTO rulebook to highlight the main agreements that could be relevant to this issue. Gabrielle, there's one issue that we haven't addressed on this stage so far, and it's dispute settlement. In very few words, what can you tell us about the relationship between dispute settlement and the issue at hand? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doa. I had understood I would intervene if the issues were not raised. But on dispute, and I'd like, if you allow me to say something about a standard that was raised already by Ambassador Usha, Ambassador Lee, but on dispute, just because I'm proud of our system, we have in the WTO that is very relevant for dealing with illicit trade, a system of experts where panels would hire experts with the involvement of the parties. And it's very different from individual experts attached to one government. And it's not an expert just of the panel. These experts are sort of judges, parallel to those sort of legal judges, and their role is to clarify the facts and explains these sort of distinctions that are necessary for illicit. I mention it because a few years ago, in another dispute at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, Judge Sima, the German judge, pointed to the WTO system of the use of expert as really something that should be considered by the ICJ and other international tribunals as a success story, mixing common law and civil law approach to help eventually the judge take a decision. But the other point you had told me that I could mention about international standards, and that's again very special of the WTO. The TBT, the SPS, the GATT to some extent state that when a government adopts domestically a standard that is basically implementing an existing international standard developed outside the WTO. That's important because in WTO, we don't negotiate standards, international standard. Government don't negotiate them here. But there is this principle that says if governments follow those negotiated outside, they are presumed to be acting consistently with the WTO, even if it could restrict trade. But the issue, and this is what Ambassador Usha raised, is that therefore you have to be aware of what is negotiated in all these expert forums. There's no other alternative. If you want to go with expert, you need to go to them. But the WTO is an immense sort of example of coherence where the trade system will say, yes, if you do respect those, it restricts trade, we will still recognize them. And it is true also for transparency. So all I wanted to share is, I mean, you've said it all. There are many, many rules that are and have been used. We've had already some disputes on illicit food for beef, for instance, changing the origin. But the WTO is very well positioned in dispute in its principle for dealing with this. And as you said, the problem is only growing. So thank you, Doa.
Gabrielle, as usual, incredibly eloquent. Thank you very much. And of course, your comments on international standards are very powerful because in this particular area, Codex is now preparing a standard on food fraud, which my understanding is in April this year got circulated to the Codex membership for comments. And I think they're very far down the line in terms of, finalizing this. So we may very soon have that standard with a definition of fraud, of food fraud, with an identification of the types of fraud, with an identification of the products that are hardest hit by the fraud, and with recommendations for measures for prevention and control. So very interesting what you have just said on the very central role of international standards within the WTO system. So thank you very much to you all. But before I release the panel, let me just see if there are questions from the room. We have a couple of questions online that are coming in, but is there anybody in the room who has a question? Yes, Ambassador, please.
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to commend you for putting this together. I haven't read the report yet, but I will. And just wanted to point out, I mean, it's been an excellent presentation by everybody. And, I was just sitting here thinking that we spend so much time arguing with each other about so many things. I'm not going to go into details, but I do think that this is an area where I would hope that, all the entire membership, we can continue working together, because of course it is can be a matter of life and death, and also of impacting criminal activity. And I do think that, again, there's a lot of issues that have been mentioned, including by Gabrielle, where we can continue to explore how, we can continue to make a dent on this issue, which sadly, as has been mentioned, will continue to grow. So thank you for putting this together.
Thank you very much. And to our outside speakers, this is the Ambassador of the United States, in case you haven't had a chance to meet her. Did you want the floor, Jeff? Yes, please.
Well, thanks. I just wanted to respond also to what Gabrielle said. In reading through this document and the one that was done about a year ago on pharmaceuticals, there's a whole alphabet soup of great agreements. The TBT has and the TFA have a lot of provisions in them for strengthening customs, for increasing transparency, for doing, risk profiling mitigation. A lot of these, there are a lot of tools in the toolbox that can be used. But I think at least from my perspective, the WTO is very good at telling countries what not to do to block trade. But I think if we were to build on your work, perhaps, is to take all of these different illicit trade related provisions and then perhaps make a compendium of them in a more of a proactive way and start helping or telling members what to do and how they can use those tools to, strengthen the mitigation of illicit trade. So.
Thank you very much. Would anybody else want to take the floor? Anyone who's in the room? If not, then, yes, please, sir, over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. And I'm Giulio Menato. I'm the Agriculture Counselor for the European Union. Certainly, in terms of European Union trade on specific agriculture products, we have unfortunately a lot to say and a lot also in terms of cost of such illicit trade. So first of all, we would like to thank the work done by the World Trade Organization, but also other, to expose all of that. Because I think the first exercise indeed is to make it transparent, to inform on the impact of illicit trade. It's not just small things. It's becoming particularly important. Become important for health, first of all, then for trade, for the illicit trade, because we have to protect the illicit producers and the illicit traders on this business that earn their money from that. and of course consumers. So exposing such information, giving the cases, showing also how the public authorities are working. The ambassador of China has indicated that in the paper there are several examples also of investigations by the European Union authorities or member states on that. We have to be all involved in that. So first of all, expose. Also the impact on and here I finish on the Sustainable Development Goals, because this is part of the major exercise that we are doing as the ambassador of the United States, reminded that this is also part of agriculture discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Christiane, please.
Yes, thank you, Doa. Just to introduce myself briefly, Christiane Wolf. I'm the secretary of the SPS committee, the Committee on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures that was mentioned a few times. I found it particularly interesting how I think pretty much all of the speakers alluded to the fact that how cross-cutting this problem is, and cross-cutting in the sense that, for example, let's say a food product has been, there's adulteration of the food product, let's say, to pick up on one example, the horse meat instead of beef in prepared food products sold in a supermarket. Of course, this is deception of the consumer. It's adulteration. It's not okay on that level. But in addition, it leads to food safety risks because the horse meat, nobody has probably checked where it's coming from, what are the levels of veterinary drugs that are present in the meat, and so on. And so in terms of dealing with this problem, I was wondering if any of you would be ready to comment on, in my view, it seems to require cooperation among the different enforcement and regulatory agencies, both at the national level, but also at the international level. And maybe if you could say something about that. Thank you.
I don't know. I mean, it sounds like more of a recommendation than a question. And I agree. It's in my notes. I was hoping for the chance to share this 4 or 5 things that I think the WTO could do going forward. And one of them is definitely to take some leadership with the other intergovernmental organizations. Some of them are right next door, like UNCTAD, who's done a lot of work. In fact, the UNCTAD ministerial just named illicit trade for the first time as a priority work area. Obviously, UNODC has been doing a lot of work in this space. WCO is outside of the UN family, but nonetheless, they bring a lot of tools to this. The OECD is more of a regional body, but as someone mentioned, they've just bumped up illicit trade into a full-blown working group under their Trade and Agriculture division. So I think there's a lot that can be done. The executive director herself mentioned that after the pharmaceutical report was done, she'd convened a roundtable with some of those same IGOs to look at pharmaceuticals. I think, and you yourself had mentioned the cross-sectoral part. So I think the problem we get into is do we make it specific sector oriented? Do we make it specific IGO oriented? What I'm trying to suggest is what if we bring it all together? I think there's an enormous amount of space for a new instrument, international instrument, to be focused on illicit trade. And if you take, the work, let's look at the amount of work that WTO did on the trade facilitation agreement. Years of negotiation and work that was put into that because you thought that the benefits could yield, about $1 trillion contribution to GDP. Well, what I've said in my own remarks is there's $1 to $3 trillion that are draining out of the global economy because of illegal trade. And I can't think of a better reason for WTO to step up and put the equal amount of effort into fighting against illegal trade as you've done with the TFA.
Thank you very much. Other questions or comments from the floor? Yes, Ambassador, please.
Sorry to take the floor again, but this exchange just reminded me of something that I should have mentioned, and I think somebody mentioned it in the panel. I agree, not just working and thinking about the health ministries and the other international organizations, but the private sector. is very important because they are the ones that are facing the challenges from the illegal sector. And, sometimes, I've had every now and then some brief conversations with big companies that do a lot of work on, tracing and making sure that supply chains are clean. And so I do think that let's not forget that, part of that is bringing them into the conversation as a baby step. I'm not sure about doing a new international instrument. That's way down the road. But I do think that at least having that conversation with health ministries, health organizations, trade, and the private sector, because that's kind of the intersection of how all this stuff comes together. Sorry to have taken the floor again.
Thank you very much. We have only 7 minutes left, and I don't want the online viewers to be frustrated, so I will just take 2 questions from the many questions that have rolled in. I'll start with Ambassador Kanabadi, a question asking about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and whether it can play a role in combating illicit trade and fraud.
I guess I'm from Africa. That's why they asked the question, huh? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But then again, you'll be confronted with the 2 sets of challenges. Not every country in Africa has the same readiness to deal with this. 2, how do you help these countries achieve institutional capacity in a short term in more or less an equivalent manner? And 3, beyond, when you do e-commerce, you realize that many countries have legislation where they have no electricity. And it's the same situation here. You have a situation where you can have legislation because it's easy to go to a number of institutions and say, help me, I need legislation. So we do the legislation and then we pray that something is going to happen, and it doesn't always happen. So AFCFTA can actually do this by working more closely with WTO as well, I think, and to see how we can do this better. But I think where AFCFTA could also help us is precisely on Codex, ISO, all the standards being set and helping countries understand better how we can get this, how we can get them more sensitized to all these problems. And something not related to AFCFTA. I asked myself the question, why is it Mauritius is so keen to have this food standards agency, food lab? There's all this pressure to be doing things all the time. I think part of it is the high level of literacy, like 96%. And then you have all those people out there, when you bring food to them, they're hungry or they taste something, it tastes good. They don't care. They have never heard of WTO or WCO or anything at all. So how do we deal with them? We can't live in an institutional world of having Trusted and Helen, however much I love them, but we have to deal with the real world as well out there, where they're not only our population to a squeeze, but millions of people who've just never heard of this. So that will be the challenge of the FCFTA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And one last question online, and this is a question to you, Helen.
Oh.
So it's a viewer who's saying that with respect to alcohol, the Interpol asks people to think about the 4 Ps, the place where they buy their alcohol, the price, if the price is suspiciously low, the packaging, if it looks strange, and the product, if it has a bad smell, etc. And the viewer is asking, how can the World Spirits Alliance leverage technology to address the problem of fraud in this sector?
Wow.
Tracking, tracing, digital verification, they're saying.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, it is a real problem, but a lot of the stuff actually, yes, you should be looking at that, but a lot of the stuff that's happening illegally is also online. So you can't actually feel the product, smell the product, see the product, right? So this is, while those are great tools, if you have it in front of you, a lot of the issue is now on e-commerce. So that is where we're working with agencies, and I'm glad that the ambassador from the US talked about this a little bit, about the private sector working with the with others. And that's where we've been doing a lot of work, actually, is really training with customs officials and also with the platforms themselves to look at this issue, because it is quite grave. And in fact, it was even worse because of COVID times, right? So this is, people are really looking online nowadays rather than going into a shop. So while those 4 Ps are great, they're not necessarily effective right now. So this is the thing with these type of issues, is that the illicit, the people who are working on this, the are really smart, right? And they're moving ahead and they're moving fast and they're moving faster than the rest of us at times. And so we have to keep up with the new technology, and new technology is important. So, and this is where we're trying to catch up, is with the e-commerce issue. So thank you for the question, though.
Well, this brings us to the end of our event. I'd like to thank the panel profusely. As well as all the contributors to the publication. And I'd like to thank everyone who's come to this event, as well as everybody online. Thank you very much. And this has certainly given us enormous food for thought going forward. So this is just the beginning, let's say, of our work in this area. Thank you.